Hello and welcome to the Tapestry. This video will cover the study of personality, different models, and their major faults. To start, we will go over personality as a study. This is a messy overview of fields of study. These factors are not categorical. These are just general associations and trends. The point is that, even given the same rigor, there are very different limitations across different subject matters and the different methods available to study them. Personality falls within psychology, which is a social study. Whereas neurology studies the objective brain, psychology studies the subjective mind. Our capability and thus confidence in researching the mind versus the brain is significantly lower. And to be clear, no, I do not recognize the social studies as sciences or accept so-called expert consensus in these fields. These have very poor track records through recent history with pseudoscience, and psychology is still currently radically pathologizing and depathologizing mental conditions with cultural changes. Even if there were the same level of rigor, soft studies are inherently more prone to error and have vastly weaker confidence. For example, we can look at a person through the lens of hard to soft study. A person's height can be measured as 5'4", using advancing tools which offer objective accountability outside our own perspectives. A person can also be observed and described as having brown hair. The observer could have poor perception, or observers could disagree about classifications like light brown versus dirty blonde. A person can be described as following instructions readily. The language we use to describe external behaviors is even more relative and arbitrary than physical features. A person's behavior then being described and interpreted as compliant is a farther step down. And finally, building constructs about people which infer that compliance is cooperative is predominantly philosophical. The Big Five or HEXACO are the most accepted and validated personality models within psychology. These models are based on the lexical hypothesis and derived from factor analysis of language. Basically, the words people use to describe personality are collected and simplified to find distinctive traits. Big Five is reduced to 5 factors, HEXACO is reduced to 6. These traits are presented as describing behavioral patterns. However, the language used is interpretive and is loaded with philosophical implications. I have worked to make these traits conceptually cleaner, more general and neutral. You can read about Pulsive traits on my website linked in the description. Before we get into other models, I want to summarize my background. I took introductory psychology in both high school and university. I found the Big Five sufficient and self-evident. I took 16 personalities and found the idea of typology interesting, but their model lacking. Then I got into cognitive type and functions. I always sought to distinguish typology as independent from and complementary to Big Five traits. I do not follow other typologies as is because they largely conflict with the Big Five rather than providing something else. I've linked an article by Clearer Thinking that includes a response letter by the official MBTI, which is more like a script than a direct counter. Although models can stand on their own, I think we have some duty to answer fundamental questions, especially in relation to traits. Alternative models often avoid or muddy these fundamentals. You can make a model with a lot of cracks work due to things like the Barnum effect or because they do incorporate genuine parts of personality. But the system as a whole is still faulty. Typology has gotten way ahead of itself and must go back to the basics if it's to contribute something more. First, we will cover the classification or misclassification of typologies and the confusion this creates between them. Personality, the systems, concepts, and their terms are ideas, which are all public domain and cannot be copyrighted. I understand people don't want their work unfairly exploited, but people being over-possessive is causing a lot of confusion. The MBTI is technically a registered trademark, but has arguably committed a kind of intellectual genericide. Marks should refer to goods or services and shouldn't be descriptive, but models like this fail to provide intellectual terms. So people naturally start using their marks as terms. What else are we supposed to use? Can providers like this still produce valid ideas? Sure, but given their methods and priorities, it's far less likely. So what is the Big Five doing better? It does have different models with different aspects or facets and different inventories to assess this. But they all share 5 factors derived from our lexicon. It also has its proprietary inventories. Even that is criticized and there's open alternatives. Overall, there's a relatively clear classification framework that is not too limited or too unrestricted. Whereas alternative models being controlled in isolated bubbles, a kind of intellectual isolationism, ends up inviting more chaos outside because orderly and open interaction between perspectives is inhibited. The MBTI claims that it indicates personality types. However, there is no evidence or good reason for this. It does correlate significantly to Big Five traits, and that is the more likely, parsimonious explanation for most of its validity. It also makes sense that constructed models that people tend to like would correspond to lexical models derived from people's language. 16 Personalities is similar but opposite in its misclassification, claiming to be a reworking of Big Five traits, not mentioning that this reworking is closer to MBTI concepts. You can read my full critique linked in the description. Overall, models misclassifying their entire system is very confusing. And all that confusion produces this: arguing over specifics, complaining about terminology overlap, and blaming people who use different definitions or who mix models for causing confusion, while doing nothing to clean up your own principles and terms, which also use public language. What is confusing is calling personality facets cognitive when there's nothing particularly cognitive about them. Most absurdly, the online consensus typology is not using MBTI either, so most people complaining are doing the same thing anyways. And if you are following a model by the book and don't want to mix it with others, then you are free to establish an isolated and clearly delineated community. As for general open forums, I don't have a problem with having multiple discussions at once. It's not hard to follow if people explain themselves. Actual personality types are highly speculative and not validated. Discussing and applying alternatives at this stage is what should be happening. If you are too confused about the various ideas going around, I would recommend sticking to the Big Five. I don't want to get too far into the weeds, and it is very weedy, but I want to address the worst faults within typological models. Although I will be directly countering MBTI and 16 personalities, this also applies to any model based on them. So this includes the online community cognitive functions. On the left, I use facet to mean the distinctive components of personality. Facets are usually harder to grasp because they are broad and deep, and thus vague. On the right, profiles are the combined facets of personality and other factors. As more factors combine, the personality becomes more specific. Profiles create more realistic, individualistic pictures of people. For example, the facet of extroversion is the general outward orientation. It doesn't say what a person tends to focus on specifically out of the vast array of external reality, or how they tend to be in this relation. An outgoing, sociable, talkative person is just one stereotypical profile of extroversion. This is probably higher energy, assertive, and people-interested. If you define extroversion by that one profile, you are ignoring people who are more mechanical or things-interested, shy or unassertive, or who prefer observing or listening to talking, and who are still outwardly oriented. The judging versus perceiving dichotomy is one falsely dichotomized profile. Judging does correlate with conscientiousness, however, it is weaker, and perceiving has a notable secondary correlation to openness. On the left, this is conceptualized as exploring options, on the right as closure. And these are real profiles of valid facet combinations. There are people with these tendencies. There are also people with the inverse. The combination of higher conscientiousness and higher openness is generally more moderated or light. This would be someone who tends to make plans and is open to adjusting them. At every step before deciding while doing, there is higher investment in the process, which leads to lower risk. In contrast, the combination of lower conscientiousness and lower openness is generally more extreme or dark. This is the profile of someone who acts immediately and absolutely. They can move through things and get results much faster, with lower investment but higher risk. In Big Five, these red lines are valid personality combinations, but according to the MBTI and 16P, these personalities don't exist. 16P even uses the term decisive as a judging tendency. This means making decisions with finality and quickly. That would indicate lower conscientiousness. How many people like this are classified as judgers because they are closed in that way? In general, the phrasing of MBTI or 16P overemphasize more closed meanings like this or with planning, rather than conscientious facets like being thorough or deliberative. Instead of being combinations of separate facets, these green lines are interpreted as core personalities with pro-con profiles. Every facet of personality can have pros and cons, however, these come from the facet itself across different contexts. For example, being spontaneous or sporadic is more beneficial for moving or acting immediately, whereas deliberation is slower. Because we live in a society and a world of natural consequences, acting on impulses tends to be less effective and less desirable. But it all depends on the context and your personal values. Whereas MBTI and 16P force together separate facets of personality. One facet, like being messy or unreliable, is the con, whereas a completely different facet, like being adaptable or open to ideas, becomes the pro. This is a chart from one study of correlation. Most have similar results. The secondary correlation between perceiving and openness is circled. The other weaker correlation is feeling and agreeableness, or thinking and disagreeableness. Conceptually, this dichotomy is even worse than its correlation and includes concepts well outside Big Five and valid personality. For me, it was the hardest to fix for cognitive type. This dichotomy is everywhere. All the synonyms and any related terms are contaminated with a landslide of false associations. I am personally tired of people using emotional versus logical as loaded labels without substance. The quote at the bottom, "People like words like jackdaws like shiny objects," is from my article, 16 Personalities or 16 Personas. If you would like to read my arguments against this dichotomy, you can read the section Feeling Like a Thinker. Which brings us to why. Why are these errors so appealing? Although Big Five is more conventional in academia, in the general population, people typically prefer typology. Whether it's 16 personalities, MBTI, or cognitive functions based on them, typologies have more popular appeal. You can read more in the article by Clearer Thinking. I think the first reason is that people simply find it easier to remember and understand more categorical or concrete profiles than abstract facets. Our minds want to simplify reality, but we need models that are less reductive and include everyone, not just exaggerated caricatures. The second reason is that people have a vested interest in their self-concepts. Whether it's for equal value or superiority, personality models which come with inherent positives and negatives are more appealing. The third reason is that people have biases beyond personality. Regardless of why, there's a phenomenon where most people tend to overestimate themselves. Personality is appealing not just as personal tendencies, but as a kind of higher aptitude like multiple intelligences. Personality is misused to ignore better measures and more significant factors like ability and experience. For example, personality becomes a means for people to conceptualize themselves as logical, in a positive sense, despite performing poorly on actual measures of logic like standardized testing. And of course their skills in the complicated real world beyond a safe, insular testing environment aren't appreciated by personal biases or fallacies. They are logical, they don't need to improve themselves, emotional people do. The same goes for any skill, whether athletic, artistic, or interpersonal. Instead of being a tool for self-awareness and growth, typologies provide systems of enablement. Now that we've established the groundwork and what doesn't, the video should become more interesting. In the next video, we will go back to the basics, to ground zero, the human mind, and answer the question, what is personality?